we are live.
Welcome everyone to today's 3C webcast. I'm Rob Ellsworth. I am the Connected Commerce Council's Vice President of Government Affairs. Today we have Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, who represents Florida's 7th Congressional District, and Professor Chris Stanton from Harvard Business School. We're here to discuss the findings of our new report that is out this month called Digitally Driven. It was produced in partnership with Google. A little bit about the Connected Commerce Council. Many of you are members. We have over 11,000 small business members nationwide. And our primary focus as a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization is to educate small businesses in how to use digital tools and marketplaces and platforms to increase productivity, to increase revenue, and to decrease costs. And little did we know about 18 months ago that this would be more important than ever as the country faces a once-in-a-century pandemic, and small businesses have relied more and more on digital tools, marketplaces, and platforms to survive. And so today we'll discuss some of the findings of our report, and also discuss with the Congresswoman different things that she's been working on as co-chair of the Blue Dog Coalition in the House. The Blue Dog Coalition is a group of moderate Democrats who are focused on small business issues and fiscal responsibility. They're sort of a bridge between the two political parties on trying to find common ground on these issues. So we appreciate her leadership on the Blue Dogs. She's also a member of the Ways and Means Committee, which is one of the most powerful committees in Congress that deals with trade and tax-related issues. Prior to serving in Congress, Congresswoman Murphy worked at the Department of Defense as a national security specialist. She worked in finance, and she's also been a professor in business-related issues. Her district includes most of downtown Orlando and northern Orlando and surrounding areas. And she is a graduate of William and Mary and my alma mater, Georgetown University. Go Hoyas. We also have Dr. Chris Stanton, who is an associate professor of business at Harvard Business School. He's an applied economist, and he's mostly focused in how research and technology is changing management within small businesses. He has been an innovative researcher in the gig economy. And prior to his current job, he taught at the University of Utah, the London School of Economics. He earned his PhD at Stanford and his MA and BA at Emory University. With that, I will turn it over to Congresswoman Murphy to discuss how COVID has affected the Orlando area and how small businesses are dealing with it.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob, for the kind introduction and inviting me to be with you all today. What I'd love to do is just give a few brief remarks about the role of Congress during this pandemic, and I'll talk a little bit about my district and what's happening there, and then outline some of the things that we've done to date and what we might be able to do going forward if we can get our act together. And I'll touch on some things that might be of interest to your audience around small business. Well, you know, I think obviously COVID-19 is the main focus right now. And first and foremost, it's a public health crisis. And in Florida, we're approaching almost 700,000 cases, over 42,000 people hospitalized, more than 13,000 deaths. And then yesterday, as we all probably saw, we just registered our 200,000th death in the United States. So those numbers are staggering. And behind every one of those numbers is you know, a family, somebody, a person, and who was sick or or dying due to this public health crisis. But this public health crisis also has given rise to an economic crisis, and it's also sparked a housing crisis, a hunger crisis, a childcare crisis, an education crisis, and a mental health crisis. And all of these things are intertwined. And we see it in my district fairly starkly, because we are an economy that is highly dependent on high touch industries, or industries that are dependent on large groups of people gathering. And so, this public health crisis has resulted in significant economic impact in a community like Orlando, where we're so heavily dependent on things that you just simply can't do in the midst of a pandemic. And so, I often talk about, the size and the scope of this challenge is significant. It's like a major fire, and, the government has the ability to dump water on this. And I think we try to throw a few pails of water on this at the very beginning. In really short order, we were able to pass 4 bipartisan bills in March and April, when the pandemic first first sort of started to spread here in the U.S. And those bills were able to provide both public health support as well as economic support. One of the major bills was what's called the CARES Act. And in CARES, there were a lot of good things that were aimed directly at supporting small businesses, helping them keep their doors open, keep people on payroll. The bill also provided folks with means to pay rent and buy food and purchase necessities. And probably one of the most well-known elements of the CARES Act was the Paycheck Protection Program. And that helped provide a little bit of a lifeline to a lot of small businesses in this country. And then CARES also included emergency economic disaster grants, some debt relief and forbearance for businesses, and then tax measures like the employee retention tax credit, which I worked really hard to get into the CARES package. We also tried to directly support individuals with enhanced unemployment benefits, an economic impact payment for almost all adults, paid leave for workers who had to stay home because their kids' childcare center or school had closed. And then it also included a moratorium on evictions for a lot of renters and homeowners. And I think while these bills were really good and necessary, what we're discovering is that they were nowhere near sufficient given the scale of this crisis. And it feels like, we're fighting a fire, but unwilling to go and get more water. And we're just hoping it's going to burn out. And, I guess maybe that's a bad analogy in a moment when much of the West is actually on fire. But I think if you asked folks in California about fires, they understand that they don't magically get better. You actually have to proactively take action. And as this pandemic continues with no clear end in sight, I think the need and the urgency for a 5th relief bill has only really grown. In May, the House passed the HEROES Act, which was a $3 trillion comprehensive relief package that included an extension of the weekly $600 federal unemployment benefits, extension of rental assistance and mortgage relief, as well as additional funding to address the public health part of this crisis, so funding for testing, tracing, and treatment. And then at that time, the Senate basically said, well, we're not going to do anything. We want to wait and see. And, what we saw in the 2 months that they waited to see was the virus continued to rage across this country. Businesses continued to struggle. Families continued to struggle. And so in late July, the Senate finally released a proposal called the HEALS Act. And unfortunately, they did it so late that we really couldn't prevent the unemployment benefits from expiring or the eviction prohibitions from expiring. And since then, negotiations have really stalled. And I've been incredibly frustrated by the lack of urgency to reach a compromise by leaders on both sides of the aisle and in both chambers. I think now is really the time for action. We have to restart bipartisan, bicameral negotiations on a 5th relief package that is really commensurate with the scale of this public health and economic crisis. And as you mentioned in my introduction, I co-chair the Blue Dog Coalition. We're a group of 27 pragmatic Democrats. And I recently led a letter from the coalition to House and Senate leaders saying, that we need to get back to the table and hammer out a bipartisan, bicameral deal. And in that letter, we noted that while there are differences between the House HEROES Act and the Senate HEALS Act, there's also a lot of common ground that we could build on. And we laid out what the contours of a deal like that should look like. And then additionally, I'm a member of the House Problem Solvers Caucus. It's a bipartisan group that's evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. There are 25 on each side. And just last week, we released a more specific COVID relief framework that's intended to kind of try to break the deadlock and bring leaders back to the negotiating table. And we're going to keep pushing for much needed bipartisan leadership and cooperation in this moment. I've also called on Speaker Pelosi to bring to the floor my bipartisan bill to expand the employee retention tax credit. As I mentioned, it was initially put in CARES, but it needs to be a bit bigger than what we got into CARES. What the ERTC essentially does is it incentivizes businesses of all sizes to keep their employees in active or furloughed status rather than laying them off. So that way they continue to receive a paycheck, some income, as well as their employer-sponsored health insurance, which I think is incredibly important in the midst of a pandemic. And a version of my expanded ERTC proposal has been introduced in both chambers of Congress as part of both the House HEROES Act as well as the Senate HEALS Act. And I think the expansion that I proposed would bring immediate relief to American workers and businesses that are still struggling with the economic impact of COVID. It's estimated that ERTC expansion could help up to 6.1 million businesses keep 60 million workers tethered to their jobs. So I really think now isn't the time for us to retreat into our partisan corners, and we really can't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. We have divided government, so principled compromise is a necessity. It's essential, and people are hurting and our economy is suffering. So we really need to act and act now. And as I laid out, there are quite a few areas that are bipartisan and that we can build from. So that's a COVID-related legislative update from DC that I hope you find useful and not too depressing. It's, to be honest, it's been really frustrating for me to see what's happening in our communities and in our schools and on Main Street, and then see the lack of political will here in Washington to help people. I know you're probably most interested in what might be included in any package that will come together related to small businesses. And I think the playing field is pretty set with what was included in either HEROES or HEALS. And then we'll see what both sides can accept and then at what level. As I mentioned, I think ERTC is a prime candidate, but a short list would also include some fixes to improve and strengthen the PPP program. It's probably some efforts to shore up funding for the depleted emergency grant program, the EIDL program, and then broadly injecting more capital into small businesses. The Senate also introduced some language on liability protections, as well as a safe and healthy workplace tax credit. And it's a credit that includes provisions from a bipartisan bill I helped to introduce over in the House that would essentially help businesses pay for cleaning services and buying cleaning supplies. And this, I think, is really important because it can help make sure that every business can provide a safe environment for both their workers and their customers. So there's a lot of bipartisan ideas that would be immediately useful to businesses trying to survive and adapt in this new environment. And I know that I'm going to continue to make the case to leadership that compromise is possible. With that, I'll close with this. My approach to my job is pretty simple. As I see it, the point of public service is to find, serious solutions to some serious problems. And in a divided government like the one we have now, where power in Congress and the White House is shared between Democrats and Republicans, the only real solutions are bipartisan solutions. It means that both sides should fight for what they believe in, but ultimately they should be willing to make principled compromises that are designed to make people's lives better. The only ideas that matter are the ones that we can actually get across the finish line and signed into law. And so, we're the government of the most powerful nation on earth. At the end of the day, regardless of whether we have a D or an R after our name, we have to get down to business and govern, especially in this moment, because I think the American people are relying on us to act. So with that, I'll stop there. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I first would just like to say how refreshing it was to hear a bipartisan approach and all the work that you're doing on these issues. I know it's a tough environment up there. When I was in Congress and during the financial crisis and collapse, working with Barney Frank and with Blue Dogs and with conservatives, it was a different environment where for one, everybody could see that we were losing 750,000 jobs a month. We were in a free-for-all, and that action needed to be taken, whether it was TARP or the stimulus plan and the Obama administration. Today, the challenge I see is that this is broader and deeper and more bottom up, and there are a lot of small businesses and families that are hurting. But at the same time, they turn on the news and see that the stock market is booming and that, half of the people that lost jobs are getting back to work. Do you think it's that news that is slowing down process for more stimulus, or is it just the campaign coming up?
Well, I think I think sometimes in Washington, people live in a bubble that is disconnected from the reality of average Americans. Because if you ask an average American, I think some 40% of Americans aren't invested in the stock market. Which direction the stock market goes isn't a reflection of how well they feel they and their families are doing. What does determine how well they and their family are doing is whether or not they have a job. And we are losing, although the unemployment numbers are going down, we're losing a million jobs a week. We have workers who are applying for unemployment, a million new workers applying for unemployment a week, and that hasn't abated in months now. And we have communities like mine where 15% unemployment in pockets of Orlando and in Central Florida. And so for those people who don't have a job, the situation is dire. They're trying to figure out how they're going to make rent and put food on the table. And oh, by the way, they've been forced to send their kids back to school in an environment where we had infection rate or positivity rates well above 5%. And I think some 30% of our Central Florida schools have had to quarantine or have had positive cases, and it's caused quite a bit of chaos. Those are the measures by which American people are marking their well-being, and by those measures, it's not looking good. And here in Washington, the political posturing, the stuff that happens inside the bubble, that's irrelevant to my average Central Floridian. In fact, it's why Americans sort of are disgusted with their government, both Democrat and Republican, because they're hurting and they're seeing leaders twiddle their thumbs and play politics. I think that's a real problem.
One of your constituents just wrote in, they wanted to know if you think there's any chance of more support before the election, and are you finding any willingness from moderate Republicans to work with Democrats?
Well, I do still hold out hope because I've been pretty clear about it. I don't want to wrap up this session and even think about the campaign until we pass another COVID bill. And I think moderates in Congress have been making that pretty clear to leadership. I think so in addition to the bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus proposal that was put forward, and Blue Dog's efforts, There were also a bunch of freshman members who wrote a letter to leadership that basically said we should not adjourn until we get a COVID bill. And now you even have a revolt by some of our members who are threatening basically to go sign the Republican discharge petition, which would, you know, provide a little bit of assistance as it related to PPP. But at this point, there are members who are so desperate to get some kind of assistance out to their communities that they're starting to play really hardball with their leadership. And so we've definitely gotten leadership's attention. And my hope is that they will identify a bipartisan proposal somewhere between the 500 billion that the Senate most recently offered and the 3 trillion that the House put out in May. I mean, somewhere in between has to be some compromise and some assistance that can make it to the American people.
Great. In our report, and Lisa, you could probably hold the Florida slide because Florida's numbers were roughly consistent with the national numbers. But we found that 93% of US small businesses were disrupted during COVID. 43% reduced hours of operation. 30% saw reduced customer demand. 28% had disrupted supply chains. 20% laid off employees. The good news and what has sort of shifted and where our group comes in on education is that over 53% of small businesses saw a benefit in increasing their use of digital technology like video conferencing, Google Ads, different tools, QuickBooks, Etsy, Pinterest, etc., to help try to get more creative to meet their marketplace. So I guess the next question on that sort of line of thinking are, how did this affect your office? Because I know you have a team in DC and you have a team in Florida, and how did digital technology help your office continue to serve the people of Florida?
Yeah, before I answer that, let me just make one observation, one comment here is that, and related to the research that you all are doing, what I've heard from a lot of entities, whether they're businesses or otherwise, or offices like mine, is that what might have taken 3 years for businesses and places to evolve into as far as technology is concerned happened in about 3 months. It sort of like got compressed. Adoption of remote work and use of different technologies, all of that adoption got compressed into a really short time frame out of necessity. And so certainly my office is no different. We immediately went to Zoom meetings, WebEx, or Microsoft Teams. And then we used digital tools to continue to stay in touch with our constituents. It's so important in this moment that I hear from my constituents. And so I've held a number of telephone town halls as well as kind of webinar style things so that we could get, like I had the small businesses at SBA on for like a virtual meeting so that my small businesses could have direct access to the SBA. And especially in those early days when the PPP regulations or rules were changing every like 48 hours, pretty much, they kept issuing new guidance. It was very confusing. And so we were able to use these platforms to provide a linkage between our small business community and the SBA and connect with our team so that we could hear the issues and try to help resolve some of the problems. But we have responded, we've gotten thousands of phone calls. We've helped a ton of people get access to unemployment insurance, and just kind of helping people through this moment. But we've adjusted. We still are not back in the offices. We've seen some of my colleagues who have gone back, brought their teams back, find that they ended up being a COVID center for their staff. And so it's just still not quite safe yet for us here in Washington. And so we'll continue to use these tools, and I feel like we've been able to continue to carry out our jobs effectively over these tools.
Great, and we thank you for for doing that and for all of your service during this tough time. I'm sure your telephone's been ringing off the hook, and a lot of people need help. And we appreciate having a moderate voice that's looking at these issues soberly and not from a political lens, but on just how to help. And we appreciate all of your leadership on that front. One last question. As Congress is considering data privacy legislation and also looking at competition in the technology industry, it may not directly affect small business members, but a lot of their concern is that it might disrupt their ability to use these tools and marketplaces at such a low cost. And if there's not sort of a small business angle or focus made to policymaking, that larger companies will have law firms that will help them deal with compliance, whereas a bakery owner or a pub owner in Orlando might not. And so how best would you advise a group like ours to make sure that our 11,000 little businesses aren't in the crosshairs and not having access to these digital tools? Either they become less effective, more expensive, or obsolete.
Yeah, Rob, you're pointing out what I often say is an issue with legislating here is that there are often well-intentioned pieces of legislation with unintended consequences. So, and so in this case, I think we can't let the good intentions result in unintended consequences at a time when small businesses are already struggling. And economic recovery for this country is dependent on how well we can, how well the small, medium-sized businesses recover revenue. And I recognize that regulation can be a drag on a small business, particularly, as you pointed out, businesses that don't have that additional resource to, navigate overly complicated regulations. And a really good example is that data privacy. Because we have yet to speak with one voice from a federal perspective, all the states or a couple of states have begun to set out their own laws. And the worst thing that can happen is if you have a patchwork. So, when you work in one, if you're in one state, it's one set of rules, and in another, it's a different set of rules. We wouldn't want that kind of situation. So what I would recommend for you all is that, you should advocate and organize to make sure policymakers see the full picture, the full impact, as well as the value of small businesses. And, it's going to take a focused effort to make sure that large companies don't gobble everything up while these, small businesses and people are struggling, because they tend to have greater access to capital and things like that that would help them ride out the storm. And so we're really going to have to work together to make sure that we create the environment for small businesses, the regulatory environment for small businesses that fosters growth and allows them to continue to compete and not allow the big guys to kind of dominate it all. So your work is incredibly important, providing voice to all of these small businesses. And so keep advocating and keep presenting us with good data. I loved the report. It was very, very thorough. And I always believe that the best way to legislate is from a place of fact and data. And you've done a great job with this study. So
thank you very much. And that's also a good segue to Professor Stanton. Chris, why don't you cover just a few of the top line items from the report, and we can kind of go from there.
Oh, sure. And thanks, Rob. And thanks for including me in this. I have been tracking this area quite carefully, and I have personally written 5 papers about the impact of COVID on small business and the ecosystem surrounding small business. And some of the findings in the report are really just eye-opening in terms of the importance of digital technologies for having small businesses survive and come through the pandemic. I think if you did the thought experiment and asked yourself what would have happened had this pandemic happened 20 years ago prior to the advent of broadband, many of the businesses that we have seen adopt digital technologies today, who are able to survive and either pivot or change their operations as a result of moving to new digital technologies, would have certainly been in a different place relative to what they have been able to do at the present time, because digital tools are available to them. It's really ironic that we're having sort of this conversation on Zoom, and I think that no one would have really foreseen this happening even just a few months ago. And so I think the pandemic has really sort of changed the reliance on some of these digital tools and what that means for our day-to-day going forward. I think the second, main point, the first being that the digital tools that are now available today have really helped small businesses survive in probably the most difficult economic time that we've lived through, is that there's still quite a lot of inequality. So one of the main messages out of the report is that there's 3 segments of business owners who responded to surveys, and you can classify these 3 segments, one of which is an enthusiastic segment where these owners have really taken to these tools and are driving their use. A second segment was probably a slightly less enthusiastic segment of owners, but these owners were kind of nudged into using more digital tools because of the pandemic themselves. And then there's a third and probably more worrying segment, which is a segment of owners that may be struggling a little bit to adopt some of the tools that have made their counterparts more resilient. And so I think there's some great commentary and some great recommendations in the report around how to educate what the report calls these maintainers, or the individuals who sort of really want to go back to business as usual, in helping the facilitation of their transition to more digitally enabled businesses. And so some of the educational recommendations and some of the recommendations around outreach, I think, are really important to deal with inequality in terms of the ability to use or to leverage digital tools in the future. But yeah, I mean, I think the main meat of the report is, one, the digital tools are important, but it's also, secondly, important to pay attention to those businesses who are maybe a little bit more digitally hesitant in terms of getting them up to speed.
Chris, have you found any disparities in between rural and urban usage of digital tools, or between minority-owned businesses, MWOB businesses, and other small business owners in any of your work? Are there access issues, or?
Going into this, I would have thought that the urban-rural divide was probably most important, but I think actually some of the other access issues may be equally important. So differences across industries. So I know Representative Murphy was sort of talking about the role of high touch or high proximity industries, where in-person contact is necessary. And I think that, we're seeing some of those industries move to more digital experiences, but it's hard to replicate theme parks, amusement parks, or other types of environments digitally. So, I think...
Is age ever a consideration?
Well, that's a good question. So I think the way that I kind of think about this is industry is pretty important, but even sort of within industries, you're seeing some gains for those businesses that were able to make digital transformations relative to others. And then there are demographic questions. I think the urban-rural divide is probably less important than probably age or probably some of the other factors that the report recognizes. That actually kind of surprised me. I would have thought the urban-rural divide would have been a bigger factor, but it turns out I think that the access to technology is really democratizing, which means that you don't have to be in a big city to take advantage of it. Rural businesses that are able to figure out how to leverage the technology seem to be doing well, along with their urban counterparts. But yeah, I think that if you drill down into some of the demographics of business owners, you'll see differences as laid out in the report, and that's probably a pretty valuable statistic for those of us who are worried about inequality in terms of access or inequality in terms of just being able to figure out how to leverage these tools.
Do you see any long-term societal changes? I know there are a lot of us that, a lot of us had the luxury of being able to work from home or remotely during the pandemic. And, I got to spend most of July in a vacation property working by the water. And I kept thinking, why on earth would I ever want to go back to an office in DC? Do you see that happening with a lot of businesses that might rethink having huge real estate leases and potentially allow people to work remotely more often? Or do you think people will be desperate when this is done to get back into an office setting and going to lunch?
I have mixed views about this, and I'll give you an anecdote before I answer the question directly. So my research team and I surveyed business owners at the very beginning of the pandemic in March. And we basically found that the business owners that we surveyed then, the modal business owner, the most prominent answer for when people thought that the pandemic would end was mid-June to early July. And obviously we've blown through that estimate. And when we resurveyed these owners in late summer, the modal answer for when they think pandemic-related disruptions would end is now sometime in the spring or summer of 2021. So I think the horizon for which owners are planning for the future has dramatically changed. And we've gone from something where people thought that we would get cases under control over sort of a 1 to 1.5 month period to where I think we broadly recognize that these changes are probably large and somewhat persistent. And that might change sort of the answer to your question about whether people are going to go back into the office or not. So I think as we adopt to new routines, as we sort of figure out how to make things work with digital tools, maybe the impetus for going back to business as usual has changed as a result of this being a more persistent and long-term shock than what we would have imagined. I wrote a paper on this as well, and the paper is consistent with many of the themes of this report, which is that there's a wide variety of responses. There are some owners who are really embracing this new normal, and they're excited about taking an all remote model and using the digital tools to the best of their ability, and they'll save on real estate, they'll save on other expenses, and other owners really want the in-person camaraderie with their teams and really want to go back to the office. And so the bottom line out of that paper is that it looks like about 16% of the workforce, according to owner surveys, will end up being remote or will end up staying remote after the pandemic. Now, you might be saying, 16% of the workforce isn't huge relative to the amount of remote work that we're seeing today. But prior to the pandemic, about 4 or 5% of the labor force was working remotely at baseline. And so this is really tripling the amount of remote work that we were seeing in the US over a period of 1 to 1.5 years. And changes on that scale just don't happen overnight. This is really an unprecedented event that we would see so much adoption of new digital technologies in the way that we're working or the way that we're thinking about sort of the uses of space or where people are locating.
We have a question from one of our participants. Why haven't all small businesses fully adopted digital tools, and what barriers are there from going all in on digital?
So there are a couple of areas that the report, I think, is really great at laying out what some of the perceived barriers are. And I'll start by saying, if you were thinking about this in a different era, the barriers are really different. Meaning, thinking about return on investment, if you had to make an investment in an on-premises server or an on-premises IT team, means that the cost of capital versus the return on that capital looks very different than the era today, where many of the tools that business owners are using are provided at close to zero cost or minimal cost or with usage-based pricing, so that the initial capital outlays look different. But still, business owners are reporting that one of their concerns is thinking about the return on investment. Now, if most of these tools are largely free or have minimal upfront cost, then you might be thinking, what investment are they talking about? And the investment that they're probably talking about is learning and their own time to adopt new tools or to educate themselves about how some of these tools are working. And so there, I think some of the education component is one of the main takeaways that we've seen, where there are these three segments of business owners, some of whom have less experience with these tools, and getting them up to speed with these tools and enabling some education or enabling some learning by doing to get them up to speed is probably really important in terms of some of these adoption questions.
Considering the data in the report, how do you think various thought leaders, whether they be in academia, in nonprofits, or in Congress, could do more to talk about the vertically integrated digital economy from an educational standpoint, but also when considering broader public policy, like the Congresswoman mentioned with competition, data privacy, et cetera, how can we educate better in discussing these topics so that small businesses aren't hurt with new proposals?
Yeah, that was a great question. And when this came up earlier, it really piqued my interest, because one of the things that I've also been worried about is some of the unintended consequences of well-intentioned legislation like HIPAA protection or FERPA protection that really has, I think, if you look sector by sector, put a damper on just the adoption of digital tools. Telemedicine has been around for a long time, but we largely were not using telemedicine visits prior to the pandemic, in part because of security requirements, where it's not like you could use Skype or use Zoom to talk to your doctor, because that wasn't HIPAA protected pre-pandemic. And now we have waivers, but it seems like all of these barriers around privacy or barriers around regulation had unintended consequences, where some sectors were left behind some of the digital advances that we have seen in other sectors. And so I think some of these regulatory issues suggest that we need to be careful in terms of the perceived liability or the perceived consequences of what regulation means for digital adoption. And I share the concerns that small business owners may be ensnared in regulatory bottlenecks or with regulatory uncertainty around privacy rules or around other things that may hamper their use of digital tools. Anecdotally, if you compare the US to Europe, where Europe now has GDPR legislation, there has been some academic work that has suggested that has really slowed the take-up of digital technologies in continental Europe, because of the severe consequences of unintended privacy violations and the compliance costs of getting that right.
And one of the things the Congresswoman brought up was the confusion around having 50 different state laws that small businesses have to comply in. It's not as if every small business only sells within their community or within their state. They're selling to national and global markets. And we have businesses in the US that are having to comply with GDPR, but they're also having to comply with, currently dozens of different state laws and potentially more. And so we've always sort of pushed for we have pushed for a national law that is workable for small businesses, and that small businesses be the focus, or at least part of the focus, as we consider, competition policy, as we consider data privacy, as we consider cybersecurity. How do we make these laws applicable and workable for somebody that owns a golf course or a restaurant?
Yeah, and I think that I agree with you that that's a great policy push. I think it also probably underscores the value of doing some of this innovation around digital tools at scale, meaning I think that the term that you use is vertically integrated, the vertically integrated digital economy. And if a player like Google, which provides a lot of tools that small businesses use, like Google Docs, advertising software, and related tools, is able to figure out some of these regulatory issues and compliance issues and solves those issues on behalf of small business owners, that's enormously valuable, because it means that you have an investment that can be spread over a number of different businesses that can take advantage of these tools. Now, if some of the central players in this market are able to take the compliance hassle out of the hands of owners that are probably operating, at a scale where it wouldn't make sense to make the investment in overcoming the compliance difficulties.
Yeah, and I think a lot of policymakers, maybe for political reasons, but they view larger technology companies as direct competitors with small businesses, when in reality, the larger businesses are able to scale and deal with a lot of the regulatory hurdles for them, but also provide marketplaces and tools and resources for small businesses. And so our concern is just that we're not hurt and we're not in the crosshairs as these changes are proposed and being debated. Chris, we discussed earlier about 93% of small businesses being disrupted in the report, reduced hours. What is your big takeaway that you want everybody participating today and watching today to know from this report, and to boil down for them and for lawmakers and for everybody else?
If I had to give you the 2-sentence answer, I think the report, 1, underscores just the value of digital tools, but 2, suggests that lawmakers and the policy community should make it easier for business owners to access these tools in any way that they can, be it through education or taking compliance costs down, especially for small business owners, because we do see the benefits of these tools, but also a subset of business owners that report that they're less optimistic about the tools or having trouble accessing them. So I think those are sort of the 2 main headlines: that digital has been incredibly important in the crisis, but we need to pay attention to access. And access means education and reducing barriers for business owners.
Great. And before we close, I just wanted to have everyone who's participating know how to find the report, Digitally Driven, that Connected Commerce Council put out in conjunction with Google. It's in a link in our chat area. And with that, I just want to thank Professor Stanton for your work and time studying these issues, and for participating in this report and here today on the webcast. I also want to thank Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, who had to jump to another meeting, for her hard work and her staff's hard work dealing with COVID and trying to find bipartisan solutions. We also hope that Congress in both chambers can work closely together, whether it's before the election, hopefully, or after, to reach some sort of a compromise to make sure that that all of our members, but that everyone in the country has a chance to meet their payroll and keep the lights on. And so with that, I just want to thank Chris and everybody on the 3C team with Connected Commerce Council for participating. And we will be in touch with you in the very near future. Thank you.
Thanks.